Now that we have our user data in the test database, we can actually write those test cases for the two routes we've created. This is going to happen in the bottom of the server test file. We'll be doing some of them together and some of them will be challenges. First up, let's test the route that returns the individual authenticated user. We'll make a new describe block for get users me. And right in here, we're going to add two test cases. One when we have a valid authentication token and one when we do not provide an authentication token, so we can make sure the private route is indeed private. First up, it should return user if authenticated. This one is going to be an asynchronous test like all of the previous ones, so I will be adding the done argument inside of our callback function. And the second test case, it should return a 401 if not authenticated. This test is going to make sure that when no token is provided, random user data is not sent back to someone who shouldn't have access to it. We're going to do the first test case together, and you'll be responsible for setting up the second one. Up here, the first thing we're going to do is make the request to the application using supertest. This is going to be a GET request, and the GET request doesn't require any special URL parameters. It's simply /users/me. Next up, we're going to set a header, and this is something we haven't done before. To set a header in supertest, we use the set method. Set takes two arguments. The header name is the first one, and the header value is the second one. In our case, the header name is going to be xauth, and the header value is going to be this value right here, the token value inside of the first user. We're going to go into the users array. We're going to grab the first item. We're going to go into its tokens array, grab the first item, and access the .token property. Now that we have our header set, we can start making some assertions about what should happen. We should get back a 200 as the HTTP status code. We can expect a 200 to come back. And we can also go ahead and expect some things about the body that comes back. I'm going to expect, and I'm going to pass in a custom expect function. And in here, we're going to make a few assertions. First up, let's assert the ID equals the appropriate ID. I'm going to expect that the response body ID property equals, using to be, the ID we have here for the first user. That means inside of 2b, I'm going to pass in users. We're going to grab the first one. We're going to grab the ID property, and we're going to call to hex string. Excellent. Now this should be the case when we're fetching a user. The ID that comes back in the body should be the ID of the user whose token we supplied. Next up, we can go ahead and assert that the emails match. I'm going to expect that the response body email property equals, using to be, the following. We're going to go into that users array and grab the first item. Then we just need to access the email property like this. And there we go. We have two assertions that make sure when we provide a valid token, we get valid data back. Now that we have this in place, we can go ahead and tack on a call to end, passing in done, just like we've done in the past. With this in place, our test case is now ready to go. We can run it from the terminal using npm test. When I run it, we should now see we have 12 test cases and all 12 are passing. It's going through the to-do test cases right now. Now we're going through the usersme, and we do indeed get the appropriate data. Now the second test that we haven't filled out, that one fails because we never call the done function. That's perfectly fine for now. This means everything is working as expected. If the email that comes back is something else, I'm going to concatenate the number 1 and we rerun the test suite, we are going to see that test failing because the email that came back on the body, which we modified just to prove a point, doesn't equal the email that we added as the seed data. Right here, you can see the test case does indeed fail. I'm going to go ahead and revert that change so it passes again and we can move on to the second function. And this is going to be your first challenge. Your challenge here is to make a call to the usersme route, the same GET request. You're not going to provide an xauth token, and all you're going to do is expect that you get a 401 back. You're also going to expect that the body is equal to an empty object, which it should be if the user is not authenticated. Once you have both of those assertions in place, make sure to call end, passing in done. This is going to wrap up the test case. And remember also, when you're comparing an empty object, which is going to be the response body, to another object, you have to use to equal, not to be. Take a moment to knock this out. Go ahead and run the test suite. Make sure both tests under get usersme are passing. When they are, go ahead and click play. All right. Hopefully you were able to add that test case and see it pass over in the terminal. First up, we got to make the request. Nothing new here. Request to the app, and we're going to make the exact same request, a get request to /users/me. And this time around, though, we will not be calling set. We want to see what happens when we don't provide the token. We can make our assertions. We're expecting a 401, which is the status code we send back from the Authenticate middleware. Then we can go ahead and make a custom assertion about the body. We can pass in the response argument to our custom callback function, and we can expect that the response body is an empty object, which it should be. We should not have any user properties on it. I'm going to expect response.body to equal an object just like this. Now we can tack on end, passing in done, and our test case is complete. If we don't get a 401, the test is going to fail. If the body includes anything except for an empty object, the test is going to fail as well. Over inside of the terminal, I'm going to rerun the test suite. We should now have 13 tests, and all of them should be passing. Moving through the to-dos tests right now, and we should be getting on to the users tests, and there we go. Both tests are passing, which is fantastic. Now that we have some test cases for the get usersme route, let's go ahead and add some test cases for the signup route. We're going to add 3, but first up, we have to add our describe block. And the route for this is a post HTTP request to /users. And then I can provide my function, and inside of here, we can add 3 test cases. Let's go ahead and call it 3 times first, then we'll worry about the actual test cases. It should create a user. This call is going to test what happens when we pass in valid data, a valid email that's not already in use, and a valid password. We should have the user created. Next up, we can test what happens when the fields are invalid. It should return validation errors if request invalid. And this one is going to make sure that when we provide either an invalid email or a password that's not at least 6 characters, the user doesn't get created. The last test we're going to write for the signup method, it should not create user if email in use. If the email is already in use, we do not want to create the user. So we're going to write a test case that verifies we do indeed get the error. Excellent. Now that we have all the test cases set up, let's go ahead and fill out the first one. This first test case is going to require that we have a unique valid email and a password. I'm going to make those 2 variables up above, email, which I'll set equal to example@example.com, and password, which I'll set equal to a valid password, such as 123MNB!! Next up, we can actually send off the request using request, passing in our app. And this one is going to be a post request, so I'll call the post method. Now the URL for this one is not going to be dynamic, so we can use a regular string as opposed to a template string, and we're going to /users. This is the route for creating a new user, and we are going to need to send some data along with this request. And this is the one that makes sure everything works when we send valid data, so I will be calling send, passing in both the email and password on our object. Email is going to get the value from the email variable above, and we'll do the same thing for password. Now that we have the request sent off, we can start making some assertions about what should happen. First up, we are expecting a 200 to be the status code that comes back. Then we can go ahead and expect that we get our XAuth token back using a custom expect call. We're expecting that the following function doesn't throw any errors. I'm going to expect that the response headers object has a header called XAuth, and in order to get the value, we're going to need to use the bracket notation as opposed to the dot notation, because our header name does have a hyphen in it, which would be invalid using dot notation. Right here, though, inside of the single quotes, we can provide the name XAuth. We're expecting this value to exist. We don't really care what it is. We just want to make sure it does exist when the user is created. Next up, we can go ahead and verify that there is an email and there is an ID. I'm going to expect that the response body has an ID. We expect the ID to exist, and we can do the exact same thing for the email. We're expecting the response body email property to be the value up above. Instead of using to exist, we can specify the actual value since we know it. Now that we have this in place, we can go ahead and call end, passing in done. I can save the file and we can run our test case and make sure everything works as expected. I'm going to rerun the entire test suite. We should now have 14 passing tests. Going through the to-dos tests now, we're in the users tests, and we do indeed have a passing test. Should create a user, passes. Now the other tests are failing, but that's expected. We haven't filled those ones out. Now, if you want, we can take this test case even a little further. Instead of passing in done, we could pass in one of our custom functions. This is going to let us query the database, making sure everything looks good there. Like we've done in other custom end functions, we're going to check if there's an error. If there is an error, we're simply going to call done, return, done, passing in the error so the test fails. If there is no errors in the assertions up above, we can go ahead and query for a user. I'm going to use user.findOne to find a user where the email equals the email we have above. This should indeed return a valid user since we just created it and got a 200 back. And then I can add on then. We're going to get the user, and we can make some assertions about the document saved in the database. For example, we could expect it exists. I'm going to expect that the user exists using toExist. We could even expect that the password does not equal the password we used, since it should have been hashed. We can expect that the user password property does not equal using toNotBe, the password variable defined above. If the user password is equal to the password above, we have a pretty big problem because that means our passwords are not getting hashed. Right after my toExpect calls, I can call done, wrapping up this test case. Now that we have this in place, I can rerun the test suite, and that test should still be passing. This time around, though, it is fetching the actual user from the database, and it's making some assertions about the document. Right here, we're moving through all the tests, and the first test is failing. Should create a user is not passing. Let's go ahead and see what the error is and try to fix it. User is not defined. That's an easy one. When you get errors like this, it usually means you forgot to do something basic, like importing the correct library. Up above, all I need to do to fix that error is create a constant, call it user, and require the user model. // we're going to go back a directory into the models directory, and we're going to grab the user file. Now that we have this in place, I should be able to save the server test file, rerun the test suite, and our test case right here should be passing. I'm going to rerun it to make sure the error was fixed, and if it was, we can move on to the two final test cases for this one. We're going through the to-dos tests now. We're at the users tests, and the first test passes, which is fantastic. All that's left to do is fill out those final two test cases, and this is going to be your second challenge. For this one, all you need to do is send across an invalid email and an invalid password. You expect a 400 to come back. If it does, then everything is working as expected. For the second one, you're going to go ahead and use an email that's already taken, which means that you're going to try to sign up using one of the emails that we use in our seed data. Either Andrew@example.com, Jen@example.com, or if you happen to name those something else, go ahead and use that instead. This request, the second one, should also fail when you have an email that's already in use and a valid password. You're going to expect a 400 to come back for that. Take a moment to knock both of those out. Make sure you get 400s for both. When you're done, run the test suite, make sure all the tests are passing, then go ahead and click play. Hopefully, you were able to get these two tests complete and passing over inside of the terminal. The first test we're going to run is going to be the one that has an invalid email and an invalid password. I'm going to request something from the application. We're going to go ahead and make a post request to the exact same URL we used above, /users in lowercase. Then we're going to go ahead and send across some data. I'll provide my object, which is going to be the data we send, and we'll send an email equal to an invalid email like and we'll send a password, which is also invalid, like 1, 2, 3. Both of these are invalid, so we can start making some assertions about what we're going to get back. We're going to expect that we get a 400 back, and then we can go ahead and call end, passing done. This test case should now pass if everything goes as expected. I'm going to save the server test file and restart the test suite over inside of the terminal. This time around, we should only have that one test case failing. The one we just filled out should indeed be passing. We're moving through the to-dos tests. Now we're in the users tests, and it's passing, which is great. We can now move on to the final test. This test makes sure that when we try to sign up a user, but that email's already in use, we get a 400 back. I'm going to kick things off by calling a request to initialize the request. We will be making a post request to the exact same URL /users. And now we can go ahead and set up our data inside of send. Now the data for this test case is supposed to be valid. It's just supposed to be already in use, which means for the email, we want to use one of the emails in our users array. I'm going to go ahead and access the first item in the users array. I'm going to grab the email and I'm going to use that right here. And this email is obviously already in the database since it's part of our seed data, so we should get a 400 back. For the password, I'm going to set it equal to a valid password like password 123 ! Next up, we can make our assertion expecting that a 400 comes back. I'm going to expect that we get a 400. Then I can call end, passing in done, and we can rerun the test suite for a final time. This time around, we should have all 16 test cases passing. If we do, we're done. We can wrap up the video by making a commit. Right here, we're moving on to the users tests, and it looks like everything did work as expected, which is fantastic. Now that we have some test cases in place for the sign up call and the get usersme call, let's go ahead and make a commit to save the changes. I'm going to run git status, and right here we have our new seed file as well as our modified server test file. I can use git add to add all of those to the next commit, and git commit with the M flag for a message. Add tests for get usersme and post users. Excellent. Now that we have this in place, we are done. I'm going to push things up to GitHub, and that is it for this one. I will see you in the next video where we keep moving through the process of adding authentication to the To-Do API.